This video is about annotation, and for this video I've decided to use the Gettysburg Address, since you'll be reading a rhetorical analysis of the Gettysburg Address this week anyway, and also because it's a short enough text that I can show you one approach that I often use when I want to look at the rhetoric of a particular text. So for this, I've gone to the website of Cornell University, which has a copy of a draft of the Gettysburg Address, and I'm using their version, so it might be a few words off from the version that you studied in schools, and also so that you know where this particular text comes from. Now, I always annotate by hand, so I printed it off, and for the rest of this video, you'll be watching me make the annotations to a hard copy that I've printed from this website. For the purposes of this video, one thing you need to know is that I have already read through the Gettysburg Address, so I know what to expect of it, and I've actually already read it aloud because I think that hearing something like a speech is really important. Today we're going to do two passes through this particular text, and the first time I go through, I'm just going to go through it with a yellow highlighter, and I'm going to highlight anything that I think is said very deliberately in a sort of interesting way. That's very, very open to interpretation, but really what I'm looking for is words and phrases and sentences and imagery that could have been said in many different ways and has been said in one particular way for rhetorical effect. So here we go. Starting at the beginning, 7 could obviously be 87. I'm interested by his use of fathers here, and then I've been noticing as I've been reading that there are a lot of references to sort of birthing things. So brought forth, conceived, dedicated, which is something that many people who are religious do to babies. The proposition that all men are created equal. This is a really important phrase that lots of people are familiar with. Now we are engaged. We're kind of carrying on past the birth moment in a great civil war. I think the use of civil is really interesting here because civil is a word that has very specific meaning within the context of war. Here we have that nation, and then it's repeated by any nation, and then we have conceived, which is another birth word, dedicated, in fact these are repeated birth words, and here's dedicate, a portion of that field, so we have a great battlefield and then we have that field, and then we have the euphemism, a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, another euphemism, that the nation might live. And you have giving life and you have ability to live. Altogether fitting and proper that we should do these. And these are words that are found in the Book of Common Prayer. Then we have some opposition. We cannot dedicate, another one of those infant words. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men. Brave is an important word. It's one that's actually spoken about in your essay that you'll be reading. Living and dead, some specific opposition. Struggled is aligned here with consecrated. And then he talks about his own power, our poor power. And then we have add or detract, another form of opposition. The world will little note, nor long remember, but it can never forget. And then we also have saying here and doing here, another form of opposition. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated, a switch of who or what we dedicate. And advanced, I think, is fascinating because it's also a military word. It is rather for us, a nice opposition structurally, rather for us as opposed to it is for us, the living rather. To be here, another dedicated to the great task, like the great battlefield, but in contrast to our poor power, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion, gave the last full measure of devotion. These dead is interesting for reasons I'll come back to, shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, and these are words, of course, that he's borrowing directly from the founding documents, shall have a new birth of freedom, going back to the metaphor for birthing, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. So, these are the words I think are interesting, and of course you'll notice that I've highlighted nearly the entire text, so I want to streamline them down a little bit. And also you'll probably notice that some of the things I've highlighted are things that are addressed in the essay that you've read. So your essay talks specifically about ethos, logos, and pathos, but there's a lot more to the Gettysburg Address, and one thing that you're welcome to do in the essays that you write for me is to think not just about the rhetorical appeals, but also to think about the particular rhetorical devices that make those appeals work so well. So in addition to thinking about ethos, logos, and pathos, you'll want to think as well about structural devices that advance those things. You can do this in two ways. You can either pick rhetorical devices that show off the rhetorical appeals, or you can write just specifically about a rhetorical device that you think is stronger or more or less important in particular than one of more of the rhetorical appeals. You will want to have 3 disparate sections for your paper, but the annotation should help you narrow this down. So here I am. I've highlighted the most interesting elements, and now I want to go through it again and see if I can find some ways in which they're roughly related. And normally if I did this, I would be doing this with different colors, so I can clearly see how many I have of each, but it's because I've just moved, I don't have those. So if you have a lot of colors, I would recommend this, but if you don't, you can do what I'm going to do here, to try to make a different mark for each type of thing. If you've read Kelly's essay, you'll know that one of the really famous things about Lincoln's appeal to pathos is his constant use of first-person plural pronouns. Lincoln talks about our fathers, we are engaged, we are met, we have come, we should do this, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow, our poor power, we say here, we highly resolve, our poor power, this is us and we're poor. And he's going to contrast that throughout the speech with the they who are the soldiers. So we have those, the brave men, they're the they have consecrated it, they who fought, these honored dead. And you'll notice he's not just making it us and them, or we and they, but he's using words like poor to describe himself and his audience, and honored to describe the men who have given their full measure. So we first have the contrast of us versus them. We have a couple other contrasts too, add or detract here. Little note, contrasted with long remember, contrasted with never forget, living and dead. Now I've got contrasts, living versus dead. I know this is really small, I'm so sorry. Little noting versus long remembering. So I've got contrast, and I also have the pathos of we. Now, I've talked a lot about the sort of fathering and birthing words, so let's look at those a little bit. Fathers, conception, you have dedication, you have more conceiving, we have more dedicating, more dedicating, more dedicating. We could argue for consecrate, could be also, and we have, of course, at the very end, new birth. So I have a lot of birth metaphors. I have a lot of euphemisms. So you'll probably know that a euphemism is when we use a word to describe something, usually something that's unpleasant. So lots of times, instead of urinating, we might say, I'm going to the bathroom, or I'm visiting the powder room, or there are actually a number of regional euphemisms for that particular activity. And another action that often gets a euphemism is death. You'll notice that we have final resting place instead of burial ground, giving their life instead of dying. And then halfway through, he sort of gives up on the euphemisms. Here we have living and dead. And then he just stops using the euphemisms a great deal. So we have the honored dead. We go back to the euphemism, forgave the last full measure of devotion, and then we go right back to the real word for dead, died again, and then we use that to contrast, another contrast, living and dying, birth metaphors, we have euphemisms, we're still doing a lot with contrast. You've probably noticed a lot of structural repetition in this, both anaphora, when you repeat words at the beginning of phrases, and epistrophe, which is when you repeat words at the end of phrases. So one of the really famous ones of the people, by the people, for the people is a really great example of epistrophe. And we also have a phrase like, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow, anaphora. These are both forms of repetition. And so you might notice that there are a lot of other elements of repetition throughout the essay, both the single words like the we, but you also have that nation or any nation, and I would argue that structurally little note, long remember, and never forget are another form of repetition. So we have a lot of repetition overall, at least 3 different kinds. You could break them down or not as you chose. And some of them are forms of parallelism and others of them are, of course, not. So at this stage, when I've already marked the things that are the most compelling to me and also worked through to figure out what I have the most of, I know that in this speech, as far as rhetorical devices are concerned, I have a lot of different kinds of repetition. I have a number of birth metaphors. I have the specific repetition of we that creates a certain sense of pathos, and I have a number of different types of contrast, and some of these would fall into more deliberate rhetorical devices as well, but we'll just call them all contrast for the time being. And if you've read Kelly's essay, you'll know that Kelly believes that there's a lot of pathos in this essay and a bit of ethos, which is really mostly garnered by the fact that Lincoln himself is an ethical or authoritative figure in the rhetorical sense of the term. And then Kelly manages to make an argument for a little bit of logos, but certainly that's the weakest. So I think one last thing that we want to do is look a little bit at how the devices we've found relate to the overall rhetorical appeals. So we already know that the we is pretty much consistently used to refer to pathos. So our fathers is going to be pathos. We have come, coming together, we are met, and then all of these phrases like we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. Kelly makes a great argument for the brave men. Poor power is also pathos. Even things like of the people, by the people, for the people, more unifying sorts of terms. These are all elements of pathos. So I think we could argue that both repetition and metaphor are used to enhance the pathos of the essay. So we definitely want to have pathos as a section in our final essay. We might even want to give repetition its own section and talk about pathos in the terms of some of the things like euphemism. We also have an amount of ethos. Kelly particularly argues that we is also ethos, but really the biggest amount of ethos comes from Lincoln. I would also argue that one of the ethical appeals here are the references to religious terms. He does have a real sense of nationalism, which as a president is very appropriate. So these might be ethical terms. We'll make these square. Civil is another ethical term, liberty, and even probably the phrases from the Declaration of Independence. This nation under God is an ethical term because it alludes to a common governing text. So these are all words that are here to remind the readers of Lincoln's national authority. So one thing I probably want to do in this essay is talk about the pathos of repetition, to talk about the ethos of Lincoln's national authority. And then I've got all of these examples of contrasts down here. And my third paragraph, instead of being about logos, as Kelly's is going to be about contrast. If I had color-coded these, it would then be very easy to write my essay by dividing up my examples into the paragraphs in which I wanted to talk about them. For now, these are the principles I'd like you to use when you annotate your own documents. Work through the documents and mark the things that you think are interesting, especially the things that you think could have been said in another way. Then go back through and see how many of them you can apply rhetorical devices or rhetorical appeals to. Look for occasions when the rhetorical devices are used to advance particular rhetorical appeals. And then from there you can go through and pick out the ones that you think are most important or realistically easiest to talk about for the duration of an essay. When you annotate your text, mark the things that are interesting and then look for rhetorical devices that are shared to great effect across multiple moments in the particular document that you're working with.